Hello and welcome to Game Design Hour. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and on each episode, I sit down with the people who create the video games you know and love. And I am back from a short hiatus and should be getting back to regularly scheduled content, starting with this episode. Without any further ado, let's meet our guest and get into the interview.
Hi, I'm Radu Muresan. I make indie video games for, I know, for a while now, 10 plus years or something. And I tend to mostly focus on thinky games like puzzle, automation, programming, that kind of stuff.
So what was the first thing that really sparked your interest in creating video games?
Oh, this would have to go really, really back. Like I think, I know, seventh or eighth grade. So I'm born and raised in Europe, in Romania. So I think the computer systems there were like the Spectrum ZXs and all of the older machines. I remember seeing at some point Prince of Persia, and then later on some other games, and it was just like so fascinating. And it just like blew my mind at the time. But I obviously didn't understand that this was all made by people, so it took a while until I think seventh grade. I started corresponding with my best friend, and just sending computer programs back and forth like tiny animations. So I think that's when it started.
So after that, how did you first kind of get into the video game industry and start making games?
Okay, so I had a quick brush with the games industry after I graduated. It's just like early 2000s, where I worked for about a year in games, and then I transitioned back into regular software development because moving countries and stuff, immigrating to Canada, and then I went on and had a career in software development, and got back into games in 2010 when I started making games for my kids, like really tiny games, more like toys than games. And then I think I've been making games ever since.
So how did you first kind of come up and brainstorm the idea for Neon Noodles?
Oh, I think this applies to all of them. So for me, as a pet peeve of mine is like everybody's like, oh, like you're so creative. Like I don't believe in creativity as a thing as much. I believe that as longer you're immersed in a space, you're going to be coming up with ideas. And so for Neon Noodles specifically, I'd been making games for a while, and I had this like a small, well, not so small Trello of game ideas and everything. And once you start collecting game ideas, after a while, you can see which ones still resonate with you. So if like a year later, you're still interested in programming some robots, and like food was always a thing that was interesting to me. And then I love the cyberpunk aesthetics. I was like, oh, sure, let's combine all of them. So I think it's always something like that. There's like some multiple things that spark interest, and just combining them together.
Pretty much every game has strange or interesting ideas that you think about in these early brainstorming processes and kind of carry with you, but sometimes don't end up getting added to the game. What were some of those early ideas for Neon Noodles that just ended up not making it in?
Oh, that's very interesting. So one of the things I discovered pretty early on is what makes programming compelling. Because I was like, obviously there's other games in the genre, programming games, and in a quest to kind of make it the more, what's the right word, like a streamlined experience, and trying to buff out all the small things that could be a problem for somebody trying to play the game. At some point, it had a different format where you were kind of like live programming, as in like you're changing the things, but at the same time, you're like also programming. So once you got to the end of the level, it was like a foregone conclusion because you already made the guacamole or something, whatever you're making, because you were seeing yourself making it. So there's like no excitement. So that felt as exciting as Excel feels to most people, because I think honestly, it's the reason for this is evolutionary. So that that dopamine kick when you're making something and you don't know if it works, and then when it works, you get like a jolt of chemicals, and that's like really cool. And then I think like that's realistically, in a nutshell, it's like what keeps programming interesting. And then I had to bring that back because it's just like the cycle of like make something and try is very compelling, but the cycle of like make something live and at the end it works, it definitely was not going anywhere. So
Tell me about creating that sort of programming system for the game, because I mean, I get it's probably difficult to create and make sure it works right every time, because there's so many different ways that the player can use it and probably also mess it up.
Yeah, fortunately for a game like Neon Noodles, which is, I guess, like for context, it's like a programming game. So you program robots to make food, and for a game like this that's very systemic and like kind of rule based, I was able to do some test automation, like a lot of test automation. going to the point where like even some of my tests were the creation of some of my tests were automated in a way. It's like complicated to explain, but fortunately I was able to cover a lot of the core functionality, like I'd say 95% plus of the core of the game with tests, and that helped, especially when changing stuff and considering there's like multiple control schemes and everything. So definitely non-trivial, but fortunately the core of the game was easier to test. Like this, the actual interactions and everything that's a bit more difficult, but how the game works, I think that worked out okay.
Managing scope is a really important part of creating video games. How did you work to manage the scope of Neon Noodles, and how did the scope sort of shift and change from the first idea to what you've now published?
Oh, how did I do that? Poorly, I would say. Like only half kidding. But so the Noodles started before COVID, and it's just I think it had certain assumptions about the available work time in my life and everything. So I think like that, with that in mind, it's a flawed project to look at, but that's the way life goes, and things happen all along the way. I think the most important thing I would say, which I haven't really done as good of a job on Neon Noodles, doing a better job on my project right now, is just like tracking effort in the most minimal ways of possible, and then just seeing how you're trending. Because I think like information is definitely at least half of the battle. Like a lot of times I see other devs just like thinking they're a few months away from release, and that's like 2 years after they think they're a few months later from release, they're still not released, because it's just, I know we're pretty bad at estimating stuff that we haven't done before, and a lot of game developers tend to do new things all the time because that's what keeps us engaged. So then the corollary of that is that you don't really know how long it's going to take for the most part. I mean, there's obviously ways you can estimate and you can be in the same space or the same genre, and then you get a better feel for it. But realistically, it's like if you're building something that's not a clone of something else and you don't know what you're building, the creation process itself, it's really hard to bound. Like it's like, when do you call it done? That's a hard question. I don't know if anybody has a. I mean, everybody has their own answer. There's no one absolute answer to that.
So you said you're doing a better job with your current project of tracking how far along you are with the game. What is your sort of process or system for tracking how far along you are?
For a bit of context, I mentioned earlier that I had a full career in software development. So that included back in the 2010s, I was an agile consultant, and so like one of the good early ones that before it became more of an industry buzzword, and that definitely helped with like understanding how like the planning process works and everything. For Neon Noodles, I did some sort of modified Kanban. Like I was using Trello and just like a priority list of tasks, and one of the things I was missing most was just like epics or just like different ways to organize. And Trello has some things, but they don't go that well. And for this project, I'm trying out a software tool called Codex with a CKS at the end. It's made by a German company that I think Machina. They made Curious Expedition. Yeah, so it's a pretty good tool. But in a nutshell, it's more of a just kind of there's different processes to estimate, but yeah, just like figure out what's left to do and put some numbers on them, and then just like keep tracking that and see how many of those numbers you can crank out in a month, a week, or 3 months and everything, and just like trend from there. And then I think that the hardest part is just knowing when something is done, because you can spend a week on making the controller support better. You can spend 3 months. So I think like that is the hardest thing, like calling something done for me. Yeah.
So Neon Noodles is a puzzle game, and it's always important to kind of reach that balance of not so difficult that the player hates it, but not so easy that the players don't find it a challenge at all. How did you as the developer work to sort of reach this balance while working on the levels?
So Neon Noodles is a bit of a special case because it's what's called like an open-ended puzzle game, which typically that means is that so what that means is that there's multiple solutions for every level, and what that also means is that in this specific case is that it's up to the user to kind of pick their own difficulty, and a lot of this is aesthetics based, like as in this doesn't look right. So for Neon Noodles, you can, let's say you decide to make a guacamole, you can make it with like 3 robots or with 1 robot, or you can use a drone, or you can use like multiple stations of the same kind or not. And it's really up to the user. So in that sense, designing the like the difficulty of the levels is not as hard as in a what I call like a traditional prescriptive puzzle game where the designer comes up with specific solutions, like typically a single solution per level, which is my game before Neon Noodles was doing that. So I'm familiar with that process. Yeah, so different ways to do it. Like there's no substitute for playtesting. Just putting it in front of people and see how it works. But in a nutshell, you can do so many different things on how to structure the overall. So individually, the difficulty of each level, but also the overall curve of the difficulty. Two games ago, what I did is I just plotted out like the puzzle difficulty and the mechanical difficulty of each level, and now we're just looking at the graph of like each level over time. So these like I plotted them out on a small chart, and then I was taking inspiration from like things like I know it sounds weird, but like horror movies or whatever, just that whole cycle of tension and release, and just trying to. So there's different vibes you can follow, where it's like you have like different like difficult levels, then you have a bit of a breather, or you're introducing new mechanics, you reinforce them, then you try them out. So there's like all these different ways you can try it. Different games have different let's say charts of the difficulty over time. With Neon Noodle specifically, like I said, it's I think the term I like to use recently is like a self-healing difficulty curve, as in it's kind of like baked in that people will kind of choose their own difficulty, just how you can kind of grind in a Souls game and like just level up over time, and then like you're just gonna hit the wall until you no longer hit the wall and pass. It's kind of the same thing here, where you choose something, and if you choose something too complicated, you're gonna simplify it. Or if it's too simple, doesn't feel right, that this robot is inefficient, then they will spend more time to add one more robot, so it's not like one robot doing all the work and then three others waiting, but just the work is spread out. And again, this is all all aesthetic and like just people deciding that this doesn't look right, but there's no right or wrong. It's just like programming. It's like you can do it 100 ways, and some are better, some are worse, depending on what you measure it against. So
with so many recipes and foods out there, how did you kind of limit it down to what you put in the game? Do you cook often, and these are recipes that you're familiar with, or are they just kind of ones you liked?
I think I've cooked virtually all of the things that I have in the game. I think there's like one recipe that I didn't really fully make from scratch. So I use like a paste for that one that was pre-made, but for the other part, I do tend to cook my own foods. And like this is the game is definitely a love story to, I don't say weird foods, but like unknown foods around the world. So for me, the criteria was like it has to be something that most people, let's say in the Western world, wouldn't have heard of, but in their own region, it's something that's very well known. So I just went around and like researched foods, and like I already cook from all areas of the world. I'm Eastern European. I live in Canada. But like my food preferences are pretty much all over, and I cook a bit of everything. So the starting was okay, and you can notice like there's some of the recipes are just like ramen and pho and like all of these like common things, and then you get into like some stuff that's like definitely not well known outside of the regions, like jollof rice or rendang beef, or there's an Iranian one. There's like all these people, like all these foods from all around the world, and like I really like all of them, because I think there's some that are like good, and some they're like more of a palate challenge for some people. But yeah, I was just sitting down with my phone and a notebook and just like Googling what are foods from this country or like this region of the world. And then like from that, it was more of a trying to figure out how complicated the food was as well, because there's like a progression in the game. There's like different regions and everything. And then I kind of like, I don't want just simple recipes. Some of them need to be more complicated. And yeah, but overall was more of a trying to represent foods from all around the world. There's like it's not explicitly explained in the game. There's like 5 regions or 5 different backgrounds in the game, and each of them corresponds to a region of the world. So there's like the America, like the North Americas, there's Europe, there's Asia, and then there's Africa and Middle East and South America. So there's like all these like 5 regions, and then trying to find foods from all the different ones and have a bit of representation, because I think there's so many amazing foods that I haven't seen in any video games. So I tried my best to fix that.
So you talked a bit about looking at the recipes and then turning them into kind of the steps for making it in the game. What was kind of that process of taking this probably kind of complex recipe and turning it into a sort of simplified step-by-step sort of thing?
Yeah, this it's a very interesting process because like in general to make a game, it's not like a you do one thing 100% and you move on to another thing 100%. So it's more of a like a back and forth of me deciding what are the constraints within the game, as in like, can you have more than 4 ingredients per recipe? Can you have multiple ingredients that are the same? Can you have multiple outputs? And then like all of these things kind of like I kind of depending on what recipes I came along and what the gameplay dictated, I kind of developed these like almost like mini patterns that like there's certain foods that you can kind of see like potatoes or something you can, or like onions you can chop once and you get one result, chop again get a different result, and then that kind of becomes almost like a pattern or like a small building block with when coming up with the recipes, and also like provide some familiarity with the to the player with like just looking at some of them and knowing it's like, okay, to do this I need to do this and that. But for the most part, I think that the difficult thing was to just abstract them away in the same sense, because you can be like, okay, you just put like sure, you make a burger, it's like it's just ground beef, so you take the beef, you grind it up and do whatever, or you can just be like there's a patty and you just like put it on the grill. So it's like there's like different degrees of like how not homemade, now how from scratch is everything. And I think like that was the more difficult part, but other than that, there was more of a just writing down the ingredients and then seeing which ones are important and not. And then like for some of them I just broke it up into different steps, so because everything is multiple steps, and like you look at a recipe, it's typically a serial recipe online, or just like step 1, 2, 3 through 5. But if you look at each of those steps, you can break it down into like mix the dry ingredients or something, and then that's like becomes its own step with its own result, and you can plug it into another recipe. So trial and error, I guess. Like I want to say one thing, because like this is always like not knowing how games are made from the outside. It's like it always felt like somebody was just like coming up and dreaming up these things, but the reality is that like you make a best guess and you try it out and then see what works and adjust. And it's a lot easier than it sounds. In some ways it's difficult in other ways.
Every game needs to be play tested. So what was your sort of play testing process for this game, and what were some important pieces of information you learned through play testing?
So for Neon Noodles, I break it out like this into short form and long form playtesting. For Neon Noodles, for short form playtesting, obviously you can like for me it was mostly events. Like some of it was pre-COVID. I went to a bunch of things, and then I had a couple like throughout COVID and after. Are we after? I don't know. And so for short form playtesting is just like festivals, going there and putting it in front of people, which kind of it has its own limitations, but you do get strangers that don't care about you or your game. So you sometimes tend to get better, more realistic feedback than you engage your friends in that. And then for long form playtesting, what I did is I found some like a relatively small amount of people in the grand scheme of things, but like I think enough to just like go through the entire game. And I was like, hey, please go through the game, record the whole thing, send it back to me. And then that was really helpful because so Neon Noodles is you probably complete anywhere between 10 to 20 hours. Like I think 10 hours on the towards the short end, if you're kind of like just like running through things a bit quickly just to complete stuff. And for me, it was very helpful to get like 10, 15, 20 hours of gameplay. And then I did this with my previous game, and that's where I learned this trick, and just like watch it 4 or 5x like times in your video player. And because you know the game so well, then you can start spotting things even if it's way faster, and it's a lot more time effective than watching people play, because like obviously I have other things to do than to watch somebody for 20 hours. So yeah, just like skim through the whole thing and watch it on higher speed, and then kind of see where people are getting stuck. I did have some analytics as well. I did not use them as much because I think like that requires a different kind of like a different scale of testing to make sure that the numbers are not, I know, like skewed, but like let's say individuals like playing more, some playing more than others and everything. So you need a bit more attention for that. Like I would say that's probably the better way to do it if you can have that scale and get as many people involved in playtesting it. But it does require more effort as well. So I think those are the different things. And yeah, I think and then obviously like watching like streamers and other people play it, which yeah, that that's always a thing. So
So you told a story using the text in between levels throughout the game. Can you tell me a bit about developing that story and how you work to tell it through the text in between the levels?
oh, that's very interesting. So the story was actually so a lot of my games start mechanics first, so gameplay first. And I had an idea for the story at the high level, but I couldn't just I could not find something that like really worked with the gameplay and like just so it felt kind of like meaningful. And because it was the whole theming is cyberpunk, and there's like I want to call like two cyberpunks, like the cyberpunk that everybody thinks of that's like bright shiny neons and rain, and there's also like the class warfare, like systemic differences kind of cyberpunk, which is like kind of underneath all of it. And I kind of also wanted to have a bit of commentary of like how would the world look if it's heading the same direction that we are today, when food becomes more of a scarcity and a status symbol and everything. And I worked with one of my friends who's like really, really good at this. Well, he's credited on the on the game for the story, and like it eventually worked out something that we can fit it in the story. And it was like a lot of back and forth to try and figure out, okay, like which levels, which mechanics go where, and like how do you introduce them? How much of a nod do you give them in the story? Like do you reference the food, but then like a month later I need to shuffle the levels around, so then it's no longer borscht here, it's something else, and I need to change the text and retranslate, and it's non-trivial to kind of get to the end of it. But I ended up being really happy with like how the story felt, and I think even the reviews tended to mention it a lot. So that worked out okay.
How large was the team that worked on the game with you?
I tend to make most of my games, I call it mostly solo, or I've heard the term nearly solo. I'd say 90 to 95% of, or maybe even more, of the work on the game is mine. And then I contract out bits and pieces for things that I'm not really good at. The credits team is like, I don't even remember. It's like maybe 8 to 10, I guess, if we're including translators, is a bunch more. But for the core part, there's like maybe 4 other people than me that were involved in a certain capacity. But like I said, these are for all of these people. This is like just like an extra thing in their professional lives or something. So I tend to engage experts or people who know like their stuff, and then I'm okay with paying a premium but getting like just like the best advice, or like just like a short intervention that like puts me on the right track, rather than trying to hire a person and manage that and everything. So that's the way I chose to to structure my work.
Which parts of the game did you sort of have to put the most time and effort into to get them just the way you wanted it?
I think I put way too much effort into the visuals, because there were some early performance problems with the audience of these games. A lot of them tend to have, they're programmers, so they tend to have very beefy computers on the CPU side, but the GPU is just like integrated from 10 years ago. So early on, there's some performance problems, and then I shifted and we changed how we're doing things so that it's kind of like 2D with some extra fluff, and then that extra fluff with just like these shader transitions and everything. I think I spent a bit too much time on it just to get everything right. And the visuals, like the neon, the UI and everything, both outside of the main gameplay and inside of the game, that it's really, I found it, I think like this is really hard to have something that's like aesthetically pleasing, but also like conveying the right information at the right time and not feeling busy. So to me, that was, I think I spent way too much time on that. And then I think the other thing that I spent a lot of time on, which is like kind of how the game started, is the whole premise that I wanted to make this controller first, or starting with support from controller from the ground up. And I mean, programming is difficult on a good day, but like once you try to make it work with either controller, or so just controller or just mouse or just keyboard or any combination of them, then it's like it's just non-trivial. And then trying to get I basically ran out of buttons on the controller, so it's like it was a difficult thing. But yeah, I think that was what made it work in a sense. So yeah, I still think it was time mostly well spent, but probably more than maybe just spend less of it in the future.
Were there any interesting ideas that you thought of for the game, put in the game at one point, stayed in, but then you ended up having to cut after playtesting, or just you couldn't make it fit?
Yeah, I think like how the game started. So one of them was what I mentioned earlier, where they like just like what makes programming. So I had this thing where you just like programming where you're like playing, so you're moving the robot around, and that's kind of programming, but also at the same time like solving the level. And I did have to take that out. One of the other things I did take out, which is kind of funny considering where my game is. So for context, my current game is an automation game, and Neon Noodles actually started as an automation game. And when I say automation game, I mean something like Factorio, where it's it is more of the live programming, isn't like you're modifying a live system. And so Neon Noodles started with an avatar. I still have some GIF somewhere that you controlled, much like in Overcooked, you had like a one character of yours, and then all these robots around. And because of the layout, like with humans, that's really easy to, because the humans will just move out of the way if you have other players. But with the robots that you program to go from one place to another, it was just like the navigation turned out to be pretty difficult. There's like these, they look like these barrels, and I tried to make them really thin so they could go around each other, but it's like really easy for something to get stuck in a corner. And then one of the core tenets of the game is determinism, because it's like programming and you want something to happen like at a different time, like you run it again and something else happens differently because it's physics. And when two cylinders touch each other, just, I don't know, the way things work in video games, they could just like take a slightly different path and then they would get stuck once, but not the other time. It just wasn't a good fix, even though like I really like the idea of just like potentially just like using a computer to help you with what you're doing. And that's kind of like, that was the core fantasy in the beginning, but then it moved on to like you just tell the computer everything to do, not just like you don't just do stuff and then bring things in. So yeah, for a brief while it was an automation game, and then it became a Zack like a programming game. I think that's the biggest thing that made it into the game, and then was kind of yanked out. But this was like very, very early on, so yeah, I don't think many people played it in that shape. So.
Is there anything that you wish you knew before starting work on the game?
I think in general how difficult these games are to make, just because it's just there's a lot of moving systems, and I think typically it seems like slightly bigger teams, and not big teams by any means, but like 4, 5, 6 people work on them rather than one person. So I think that was my one thing that I wish I knew going in. But with a lot of these things, it's really hard because we're like, I think I mentioned this earlier, like we're really driven by innovation and by doing new things. So it kind of comes with the territory. If I wanted to make a programming game like any other programming games, then like yes, I wouldn't have run into some of the things, but trying to like invent something new or break new ground, and that's going to be a bit more difficult.
Many game devs think that finishing the game, you're done, you publish it, it's a hit. But there's a lot of steps after finishing the game. Can you tell me a bit about sort of the publishing and advertising process and what that was like for you, and kind of what lessons you learned from this time that you will build on for next time?
So typically like the marketing and PR, it like if you leave it for the end, that's a surefire way to not do that well. So it has to be like a process along the way that also continues after, but a lot of the groundwork is set like in motion before launch and reaching out. In terms of like supporting, you're always gonna, I think like this also depends on where the game is at, and if there's any bugs or anything, and what people feel like if there's anything missing from the game, then you may have to address that. I think it's just safe to bucket like depending on the game. This is like a one and done kind of game. That's not like a forever live, like a life service type game. Then just put it out, and you can, I don't know, budget like a small amount of months to just like maintain it and make sure that everything works. Because like even you play tested, you're always going to have surprises. I had surprises during my launch, which I wish that those surprises showed up a bit earlier, but they didn't. So yeah, but I think there's like, for me it was more, I think like a bit of the planning along the way that I would bring as new lessons into the new one. And also with like PR marketing, I like, because I was mostly solo and I did get help, there are certain limits to like brought in by the way I did things and I structured things, and like for like specifically for marketing. And I'm trying to potentially do things a bit differently and get some different kind of external help for this one, just to free up my mind to focus on the things I'm good at, because I think that's key in this whole endeavor.
Are there any fun, small sort of details throughout the game that you really like, but you don't see many players notice?
So there's a few things. There's like a few. I don't know if they're called like Easter eggs or nods. So I did this with both of my games that I released. I owe making games to my kids indirectly because I started making games for them, and then those picked up to the point where I could quit my job and do this full time. A long time ago, so that's reflected in the name of my company, which is Vivid Helix, and is inspired by the name of my kids, David and Felix. But also, I've tried to put some tiny nods in the game, like the robot in 2 games ago, not Neon Noodles. Before that was called DF64, just because 6 and 4 were the ages of my kids at the time and their initials. And then in this one, I have some. In the European region, there's a Chez Felix, like the restaurant on the side of the street, and there's a like an ATM that has like David Tech or something like that. So there's just like all of these tiny, and in the Asian region, I got somebody to write the names of my kids and put them up on the signs, like they're just like hidden in the background. So I think like those are just like my just like a cute nod to my kids about like things that they probably don't care about right now. So, but I still I'm happy I added them to the game. Other than that, I don't know. I think like that's the thing. Like there was a lot of research that went into like looking at the regions and trying to make them representative of their area in the world, and how would that look in a while. And like that may not be immediately obvious, but like the Middle Eastern region, there's like definitely inspired by Egypt and like things in real life, and same with Europe, or like there's real places where a lot of these things draw inspiration from.
Looking back now, is there anything you wish you could have done differently before the initial launch of the game?
I don't know if before the initial launch. So I think I'm very torn about this, because if I did the planning thing that I'm keep talking about, then actually realized how much work is there left to do, then I have taken some drastic measures, like reducing the scope of the game, or just like making another game altogether. So I feel like sometimes ignorance is is bliss, that it can lead you to other things. I would not advocate this. Knowledge is always better, but I think like that's it's like one of those mistakes that like would like the game would not be possible without this mistake. So I don't know. I feel conflicted about saying like I would change that, because then there may be no game left. But I think like that would be the biggest thing. And like kidding aside, just like realistically knowing how much is left to work on the game is good, because then you don't drag along, and it can have certain other mental implications along the way and everything. So yeah, I think that would be the biggest thing. Just like focus a bit more on planning. Is just and I know all of those things. It's just when you're super busy, then you just have to prioritize, and important things may feel like less important than other things. Like the game still need to be finished, and it's just it's like, oh yeah, we'll get to this when we get to this, and kind of got to it along the way. But it's but some lessons learned along the way.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to go and create their first game?
I'd say like start small, like really, really small. Like I knew about this, and I still stumbled into it. So I mentioned I was making kids games. And my first game, I mean, like I'm not counting my earlier period of like when I started making games again in like 2010. My first game, I'm doing air quotes about around the word game, was something I called it Escape the Bee. So it was like a stock image of a field, like a drawing of a field, and a stock image of a bee. And you touch the phone screen, and the bee sprite would move towards your finger. When it touched your finger, then it would vibrate the phone. It would buzz, right? And that was like took like 1 hour to make, not even knowing Android and everything. And I was like, that was just about the right size. And then I did like 1 hour, then like 1 day, then like 1 week, then 2 weeks, then 1 month, then 3 months, then 2 years, then 5 years. And now I'm like trying to scale it back. But I'd say starting small and just keeping that iteration cycle really, really short, like between like whatever you're doing, whether you like whatever discipline you're working on, just like find a way to assess what you're working on. Don't go in a cave and like spend 5 years. Just like get feedback from yourself, from others, from anything. Just like try to short circuit the learning, I think is the trick, really. So I think there's not much more to it. I mean, that can go a long way.
What's next for you? What are you working on now?
It's unannounced. I think the only thing that I'm okay to announce right now is that it's an automation game, and it's pretty exciting. I'm quite excited because the initial feedback is it's really, really good. So
Well, thank you so much for sitting down with me today. It's been good talking with you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you so much for watching. That is the episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with the Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or TikTok at Game Design Hour. Also, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And if you think a friend might like the show, make sure to share it with them. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.